Hey, true crime fans, welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep. We've been reading Buried Beneath the Boarding House, and this is the 11th episode. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe so you can go into the playlist and start really any true crime book we've covered from the very beginning. Let's get into episode 11 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. Partnerships dissolved. If Chief had been a man of greater intelligence, then he may have realized that Dorothea did not keep the people that knew about her crimes around for very long. One by one, he had helped her to bury everyone who might be able to implicate her in the murders. Everyone except him. Perhaps he fell for the same deception as all of her other victims, that this little old woman was truly harmless. He knew that she could kill, but that didn't mean he believed she was capable of harming a strong man like him instead of the sickly and the elderly that she had preyed on to date. It didn't even occur to him that anything might be untoward when she had him to demolish a greenhouse in the back garden and prepare to lay a concrete slab over it. In February of 1987, the house gained a new resident who was unlikely to go anywhere soon. Another one of the city's sickly who couldn't quite qualify for palliative care. Leona Carpenter was discharged from the hospital directly into Dorothea's care. At 77 years old, Leona had been fighting a long war with cancer, the last battle of which had been a prolonged brain surgery to remove the latest of her tumors. Dorothea stunned the ambulance drivers who were dropping off to her with the quality of care that she was prepared to offer. She had set up one of the sofas in the living room as a daybed, and as they watched, she made a little nest of blankets for the old woman, who until that day had been a total stranger. Leona herself was completely overwhelmed by this kindness, singing Dorothea's praises to anyone who listened. Dorothea enjoyed this second-hand sympathy and praise for as long as it lasted, but after 2 weeks of waiting hand and foot on the old woman, she started to lose her patience. Leona didn't seem to be getting any better, and the few weeks of behaving like a nurse's aide again had reminded Dorothea why she had quit that noble profession years before. She had no patience for the complaints and had a poor temperament for the constant demands. She delegated as many jobs as she could to the other residents, but even that wasn't enough to take the pressure off. When it became apparent that nobody was going to come and check up on Leona so long as Dorothea continued to pass along good reports on her health, she sought the easiest way out of the situation. Leona was already dazed and confused from the operation, consuming more pills than the rest of the house combined on a daily basis anyway. It was hardly difficult for Dorothea to add a few more medications into the mix when her temper had frayed too far. She had been prepared for this eventuality from the beginning, with plastic sheeting placed underneath the blankets that she had laid out for Leona's comfort. Another cocoon ready-made for the disposal of a corpse. The new area destined to be covered in concrete wasn't prepared yet, so Dorothea and Chief dug a shallow hole between a tree and the garden's border fence, fully intending to relocate the remains to a more permanent resting place later when they had the time. Leona's fragile and sickness withered body dropped into it without a trace. Carol Durning was the next resident to receive Dorothea's attention. She had arrived in the boarding house at the start of the year and had done her best to keep her head down, But the fact that she was still there after 3 months seemed to concern Dorothea. Carol seemed entirely immune to Dorothea's dubious charms. She had been through enough in her life to ignore any social pressure from the old woman or from the other residents to conform. And she was out of her room like a shot every time that the mailman came around. Because of all this, Dorothea was careful around Carol, taking care to keep any information about her illegal activities well away from her, since she couldn't be trusted. Keeping her isolated throughout her tenure in the boarding house should have dealt with the problem, but if anything, it just made matters worse. Instead of being driven out as a pariah, Carol became a rallying point for those who didn't like Dorothea's regime. Even residents who had gone with the flow for years began questioning the rightness of Dorothea's controlling of their state-given money. As a new arrival, James Gallup, fresh out of the hospital, was one of the residents who rallied to her. He argued back and forth with Dorothea about his money, demanding that she turn it over to him, else he would report her to the police. Dorothea couldn't afford to have a policeman wandering around her house. Not anymore. She no longer had the clout at City Hall or the Commissioner's office to make her problems disappear. Where before she had only had figurative skeletons in her closet, she now had literal decomposing corpses in her garden. James would have to be dealt with. Like most of Dorothea's preferred victims, he was in ill health. He had survived cancer and a massive heart attack in the year before he was passed into her care, and the boarding house was the first place outside of a hospital that he could have called home for many years before that. His health problems had destroyed any trace of a life that he had had before, friends and family falling out of touch as he lingered on the verge of death day after day, week after week, month after month. At 62 years old, he was entirely alone, and by the time that he arrived in Dorothea's care, all trace of the man he was before, everything that he had been, was seared away by his burning primal need for survival. He wasn't suspicious of Dorothea's attempts at kindness. He'd been on the receiving end of that cold sympathy from medical staff for so long, it felt like his normal state of interaction by this point. But he was fiercely protective of his independence now that he was starting to get it back. He took his medicine by himself. He wanted control of his own money, and he kept his room in the boarding house as a private space that Dorothea was clearly not welcome in. It made it very difficult to kill him. She managed to slip some sleeping pills to him in lieu of painkillers, but he quickly became wise to that and was heard loudly complaining that her medicine always made him sleepy. He complained long and loud enough that Dorothea didn't dare to make another failed attempt at his life. She had to wait and make certain that the next time she would be successful. Dorothea was so fixated on dealing with the immediate threat of James that the greater threat of Carol completely slipped her mind. Carol had slipped through her fingers. After 6 months of being treated like garbage, Carol moved out of the boarding house on her own accord, though Dorothea would later claim to have evicted her. She had seen very little of what happened in the house on F Street, and she remained tight-lipped about what she had seen. Even so, she was still a witness who had slipped out of Dorothea's reach, which sent Dorothea into a spiral of panic. Almost immediately after Carol's departure in July, Dorothea ground up a lethal dose of sleeping pills and mixed them into James's food. It was a risky move to poison someone in full view of the whole house, and if he had noticed and complained, then she might very well have been exposed. But with the depleted number of guests in the house, Dorothea decided to take that risk, regardless of the consequences. Using Dorothy and Ruth's identification cards, modified with her picture, in addition to her contacts in the medical profession, Dorothea had been able to secure multiple sources of sleeping pills. She stockpiled many different types of medication under the guise of needing them to care for her residents and the community members who still sought out La Doctora for their care rather than trusting the American medical establishment. This meant that when she committed to killing James, she was more than capable of delivering a dose that could have killed him, right there at the table. As it was, he didn't pass out until after dinner, when the group had moved through to the living room to listen to music. He may have been dead there and then, or Dorothea may have plied him with more drugs once she had dragged him off to her rooms. Either way, Chief was back the next morning, patting down a fresh patch of turned soil in the back garden before the sun had even risen. Throughout this whole campaign of murder, the complaints about the horrible smells in Dorothea's boarding house had continued to be voiced. She blamed her fertilizers, dead rats under the floorboards, and trouble with the drains to various neighbors at different times, the story ever shifting as she spat out excuses far too casually, assuming that the neighbors never spoke amongst themselves, assuming that she was the center of the world around which all other people orbited. She had spent a lifetime rewriting her history as she saw fit, remaking the world to suit the story that she was trying to tell. It was hardly surprising that she no longer saw other people as human, only as backing characters in her own grand drama. After all, a few years down the line, when she told a story about them, they could be completely changed by just a twist of the tongue. Only Dorothea's fantasy world was real to her. Everything else was just a nuisance to be navigated. With the plot out back finally ready for the concrete to be laid down, Dorothea decided to close another chapter of the story that would never be told. After another hard day of work out in the back garden, Dorothea invited Chief up to her room for some drinks. By this point in their relationship, this was a fairly regular occurrence, certainly not something that would raise the eyebrows of any of the residents, nor of Chief himself. Dorothea kept a stock of good liquor in her private bar up in her rooms, kept under lock and key throughout the day to keep any sticky-fingered alcoholics from creeping up the stairs. It was a selection that Chief was always excited to sample. Dorothea made up fancy cocktails so potent that they could make the hair on the back of his neck stand up, things that made the rot gut whiskey that he drank every other night pale in comparison. They settled into their usual routine of drinks and companionable silence a little later than usual, since Chief had worked through until dusk to get everything ready for tomorrow's concrete pouring. The alcohol did its soothing work, loosening up all the tight muscles across his back, and Dorothea seemed even more pleasant as usual, refilling his glass over and over without his having to make the usual hints to get things flowing. If he had been a smarter man, he might have realized that she was being uncharacteristically accommodating, but as it was, he just felt like he was being rewarded for a job well done. There were a lot of bodies out there in the back garden, under the place where the greenhouse used to be. More bodies than he could even remember burying, in truth. and Dorothea was probably relieved that she could finally put all of them behind her. He had never brought her story about burying the bodies as a benefits scam. He had never bought her story about burying the bodies as a benefits scam. He knew that she had to be killing the people that lived here because there was just too many bodies getting planted out in the garden, in the basement, to have died of natural causes. Just because he knew, it didn't mean that he had to speak about it. The one thing his time in the army had taught him was that you didn't open your mouth about things that didn't directly concern you. Not if you didn't want trouble raining down on you from unexpected directions and sniper shots bouncing off trees beside your head that couldn't possibly have come from the enemy camp. He didn't usually drift into self-reflection and painful memories when he drank. That was half the reason that he drank. But for some reason that night, he found himself drifting off into a flowing river of them. He was so lost in thought that he barely even flinched when he felt Dorothea touch him. His whole world felt like it was wrapped up in cotton wool. Nothing was quite real. Nothing could hurt him anymore. He didn't even realize that he had been walked through to the bedroom. Didn't even think that the plastic sheeting laid over the blankets was anything out of the ordinary. This was how he'd always seen Dorothea's bed. Every time he had been here to drag out a body, the plastic had been there. He was drugged so heavily that alarm bells didn't even start to ring when she laid him down and started wrapping him up. He could feel his breath, trapped wet between his face and the plastic sheeting. He couldn't move his arms or legs, but he wasn't sure that if it was because the wrap was holding them in place or that he was too disconnected from his own body to get his limbs to obey him. Only when Dorothea wrapped the sheets and blankets around him and began to stitch did fear finally rear up inside him. Only when the light of the bulb swaying overhead was blotted out by cloth and the looming shadow of the old woman did even a hint of awareness creep through. She was killing him. Perhaps he was already unconscious, and this was just a dream. For all that he knew, he was already buried out in the garden, and the hot, laborious breaths that he was trying to draw inside the plastic were the last of his air. The next morning, Dorothea went out alone to pour the concrete and seal off the fresh turned soil that had once been the garden shed. She had plans to put a new shed up on top of it eventually, but there was no rush for that. It would take her some time to select a new handyman for the property, one who'd be up for doing that kind of heavy work. It was such a shame that Chief had just vanished in the night without a word to anyone. She expressed her disappointment to anyone who would listen when they asked after the hulking man who had become a fixture of the neighborhood. She had given him his pay for the week, and he had run off without so much as a thank you, and nobody had seen him again. Compared to the expansive nature of Dorothea's usual tall tales, it was a bit of an anticlimax. It was such a bland story that it soon faded from everyone's collective memory. They had expected Chief's presence to end with a bang, with a robbery or a murder. Instead, he had faded away without a sound, just another homeless man drifting on when he grew tired of the place where he had settled. The relationship had been of great benefit to Dorothea over the last few years, but now she was becoming paranoid, and the greed that had always driven her actions had kicked into overdrive. She didn't want to share the takings from her criminal enterprise with some lowlife who couldn't understand the complexities of forging a check, and she couldn't afford to have anyone around who understood the full picture except her. Even now, at the height of her hubris, when she felt at her most invulnerable, she was planning her defense should one of the bodies ever be discovered. And that entire plan hinged on her version of events being the only one that was ever told. She took one night of rest after spending a whole day out in the back of the house, spreading concrete within the wooden frame Chief had set up. She then went back to trawling the bars for new customers. Her expensive tastes couldn't be satisfied without a never-ending flow of new boarders. Small comforts that had made her feel more secure after her chaotic childhood had become more and more important as the years went by, and she had lost the respect of the people who she had tried so hard to curry favor with. They consumed her, and in turn, the lives of one resident after another. Without Chief on call, the disposal of bodies became a pressing concern for Dorothea once more. The rate of her murders went from a tide to a trickle overnight, but they didn't certainly stop. Dorothea would never stop now that she had a taste of how easy murder could make her life. Like the joiner who only has a hammer and views all problems as a nail, Dorothea looked upon her extensive medicine cabinet as a cure-all, not only for the physical ailments, but also for any troubles all in her life. Through killing, she could control absolutely everything. She could make the chaos of the world into order. She could make it all fit into her story perfectly. In October of 1987, Vera Martin arrived in the boarding house, signed all of the paperwork that Dorothea had presented to her, and was never seen in public again. Before now, there had always been a window of opportunity for escape, a chance for the new arrivals to meet and greet the other residents of the boarding house and get settled in before they mysteriously moved along. Vera never even got the chance to sit down to one of Dorothea's famous home-cooked meals. Guided directly upstairs, once her belongings were locked away in one of the many rooms, she was nestled in Dorothea's living room with a cocktail in her hand before she could even be noticed. She was drugged, bedded, and wrapped so swiftly that Dorothea forgot to search her for valuables before dragging her down the stairs to be stowed away. Homer Myers was another of Dorothea's longtime residents, but he managed to miss her lethal intentions by virtue of staying quiet and mostly obedient during his 2-year tenure at the boarding house. When she handed him the forms that were required for her to cash his Social Security checks, he didn't argue with her. He just misplaced them. When she tried again in a few months, he misplaced them all over again. Eventually, she stopped trying, judging the man to be too slow-witted to present a threat to her, an assumption that may not have been entirely unfair, given that after her disposal of Chief, she convinced Homer to dig a grave in her garden without him ever realizing its purpose, even when no peach tree was ever planted in the 6-foot-deep hole he had dug one sweltering afternoon. When Dorothea hauled the corpse out and began shoveling dirt down onto her, the watch on Vera's wrist was still ticking. Beneath the soil, in the dark, it would go on ticking, counting off the moments until it saw the light of day once more. It wouldn't be long. Even preying on the most vulnerable in society, Dorothea's murderous ways would not go unnoticed forever. All it would take was one victim who was not so easily forgotten. That wraps up episode 11 of Buried Beneath the Boarding House. If you're enjoying this bedtime book series so far, please make sure you hit the like button. It really helps the channel. Thank you guys so much for being here. I truly appreciate your support in our series, Crying Me to Sleep. Until next time, good night.